Hello everyone, I'm Professor Paul Carrier of the Western Michigan University Thomas M. Cooley Law School. And before I head to the airport for some Thanksgiving travel, I'd like to provide some information with regard to Class 12 of our sales class. We're nearing the end of the course. After today's class, after Class 12, there is only one more substantive class, then a review, and then a final exam. We are in the area today of remedies. And there are the primary remedies that a buyer can get if the seller breaches, and those are in 2-711 of the UCC and following. And there are damages that the seller can get if the buyer breaches, and those are found in the early 2700s between 2703 to 2-710. Before we do that, though, let's talk about two particularly specialized remedies in the case of the learning of insolvency of the other party. And so you have one party going insolvent, leading to breach. The non-breaching party could try to sue, but maybe there might be a chance to actually get the goods, whether you're the buyer asking from the seller or you're the seller trying to get them back from the buyer before, for example, there's a bankruptcy and everything is locked up in a bankruptcy estate where everyone gets in line in front of the trustee and gets perhaps pennies on the dollar of what would actually be owed. So under 2-502 called reclamation, this is where the seller is going insolvent and the buyer wants to get goods back. First thing, under 2-501, there's a special interest in property, an insurable interest that a buyer can acquire even while it's in the seller's possession. Okay, it's the insurability idea, where the goods with a seller have been identified to a buyer, a particular buyer. Those have a special interest. We say that those have been identified to the contract. And if that has been done, the buyer then can exercise his or her 2-502 rights of reclamation. And if the buyer has paid a deposit and then tenders the rest, or if the buyer has paid everything up front, the buyer has the ability, with a few more elements, to actually demand the seller to deliver those goods, rather than get in line and sue during a bankruptcy, which is probably not as good an option. If I call them consumer goods. If something is to be used for the household, for family, and for friends, like a blender, like a toaster, like a TV, the buyer, if he or she's paid a deposit and then tenders the rest, or has paid the full amount up front, has the ability to, if the good has been identified to the contract, to go and get it, as long as obviously you can't commit trespass or any kind of violence. But if the seller doesn't mind, the buyer has the right to go into the warehouse, to go into the store, to get it, or to have it shipped. Okay? And this falls outside of a bankruptcy trustee's grasp. If it's not a consumer good, let's say it's 1,000 light bulbs, expensive light bulbs that go into the gyms for basketball courts, which are very expensive. They're not consumer items. There's a difference. If an installment payment has been paid, then the buyer is able, if the goods have already been identified to his or her contract, to go within 10 days of that payment, or that installment payment, to go and get those goods, if they're still in a warehouse, for example, and identified. If a payment has been made and then the buyer learns of insolvency after that point, then the goods stay where they are, and I would presume that they would fall into a bankruptcy estate and the buyer has to seek other remedies. Now, what if it's the buyer going insolvent and it is the seller that wants to get goods back that have already been shipped or already been delivered? That is also possible under 2-702. Okay? First, if the seller learns of insolvency, the seller can stop shipment and demand cash payment, even if that is against the terms of the contract. So, if you learn on pretty good authority that the buyer doesn't have the cash to pay and will not be able to pay and is probably going to go bankrupt, the seller can stop, not ship, and ask for cash. Okay? If the seller learns of the insolvency, that moment of learning about the insolvency, if there's been shipment or in fact tender, within 10 days of that shipment or tender, the seller is able to go get those goods back. Again, you cannot commit trespass or do any violence to self-help yourself into those goods. However, if you've shipped them, if you've delivered them, if you've tendered them, and then you learn within 10 days of that insolvency, you can go back and get them. Let me state that another way. I think I messed up my verbiage just a little bit. if something's been shipped or tendered, and they're on the way to or in the possession of the insolvent buyer. If the seller learns of insolvency, the clock starts ticking, and the seller can go back and get those goods if they can still be found within 10 days of the learning of that insolvency. If it's later than that, the seller has to look for other remedies. That 10-day rule, here's probably the most testable rule for this particular section. If the buyer has given assurances to the seller that the buyer is solvent within 3 months of this problem, so for example, the seller asks, even routinely, I'm shipping next month, are you still solvent, can you pay? And the buyer says yes. If it's within 3 months of this insolvency problem, then that 10-day period is gone. Is so that if the seller takes the step to ask for assurance of solvency, then the 10-day ability to grab back goods that have been shipped, delivered, or at least tendered to the buyer, the 10-day period is gone. And the seller can do that for 1, 2 years later, 2 years later, 3 years later, if they are still somewhere where they could be had. Okay? A quick word on insolvency. With regard to insolvency, it's not necessarily the actual bankruptcy definition. It's a little bit looser than that, but it's not something I want to go into in specific detail. It's, in some ways, you'll know it when you see it. The person can't pay the bills as they come due and things are starting to go wrong. It doesn't necessarily have to be a balance sheet negative cash flow problem. It's basically that the buyer can't pay the bills as they become due. And then that insolvency will trigger either the buyer's right to get identified goods from the seller, pursuant to the way I just mentioned, or the seller can get goods back from the buyer, as I just mentioned. The first one being 2-502, the second one being 2-702. Another thing, liquidated damages. If you had me for contracts, one, you learn that courts don't like liquidated damages but allow them. Courts like even less penal or punitive damages. They're allowable if you separately plead and prove a tort as well as a contractual breach at the same time. But they have to be coexisting, right, and co-provable, or separately provable. But anyway, the UCC test for liquidated damages is basically the same as the common law test with one extra thing. Basically, the idea is this. If one party to a contract takes reasonable steps to estimate the losses. So you have to come up with an estimated loss that's reasonable because you're putting it into the contract before a breach even occurs. In fact, you're estimating it, you're assuming it. If you do that reasonably, and it's somewhat difficult for the court to determine actual damages. Maybe the damages occur across the world and it's hard to get information. Maybe you need to hear a lot of witnesses to determine what the damages are. That makes it difficult for the court. And so if it's somewhat difficult for the court, courts are more amenable to consideration of a liquidated damages clause. Okay? So, reasonable calculation, not easy to determine. Also, not penalty, not penal. Okay? If it looks like the liquidated damages are on the high end, the courts might look at that as a penalty and then disallow. Okay? But if you meet those tests, courts at common law will allow a liquidated damages clause. The UCC in 2-718 sub 1 adds one more criterion or one more test. Same thing, same test as common law, but the UCC allows courts, in fact, calls upon courts to take one last look at what the actual damages were. Remember, at common law, you look at whether or not liquidated damages clauses meet the test at the time of contracting, not after. And so if something goes wrong that was not anticipated, the liquidated damages, if they were done properly up front, are still upheld. The UCC goes one step further and takes one more look just to make sure there's not a huge disparity between liquidated, the estimate, and actual. And if the actuals are significantly different, then the court in a UCC situation may be able to disallow the application of a liquidated damages clause. There's a special rule, I believe it's in 2-718 sub 2, with regard to a breaching buyer's right to restitution. Even the breaching party is entitled to get some damages back. And the thing is the breaching party, if it's a buyer, is able to get back a down payment, the lion's share of a down payment. However, that down payment is reduced in restitution by a little bit of nuisance value for the non-breaching seller. And that would be either 20% of the deposit so that the seller could keep, the non-breaching seller could keep, or $500, whichever is less. So look at the amount of the deposit which is being requested for restitution, subtract the lesser of $500 or 20% of that amount. And that is what the seller gets to keep basically as a nuisance value. Okay? Oh, by the way, did I mention? If the seller, I should go back to 2702. If the seller exercises its right to get goods back when the buyer goes insolvent, that's the only remedy the seller gets. There's no other remedy available. Typical damages for the seller, I'll make this very quick. This is well covered in the book and in other places. The seller could resell, and then the differential the seller would get as damages for a buyer breach would be resale price less the contract price, whatever the differential is, plus incidentals, no consequentials, less expenses saved. There's also 2708, no resale. If the seller doesn't resell, it would be the market price, time and place of tender, less the market price, that differential, or the unpaid part of the contract price, plus incidental damages, again no consequentials, less expenses saved. 2708 sub 2, probably the most testable, that's the lost profit section. If the seller doesn't resell, and the seller is a volume seller, that seller loses a sale if he or she's got a warehouse full of that product. So the buyer could say, I'm not buying, the next guy will, so I mitigated my damages, the next guy will buy it. But the truth is the damage is that extra lost profit on that lost sale. So 2708 sub 2 catches that and allows lost profits, including calculation of reasonable overhead, overtime, electricity charges, etc., as the lost profit on a sale where a buyer walks away. Look for a warehouse, look for a large volume. And then if that's the case and the buyer walks away in breach, you would probably be applying 2-708 subsection 2 on the lost volume sale, which is the lost profits idea. Okay? A seller, it's not typical, but a seller is able to get specific performance, and that's the action for the price, and you see that in 2-709. Okay? Same basic rules as common law. There has to be no adequate remedy at law for some reason, and then the seller can ask for specific performance. What if it is the seller breaching and the buyer wants damages? Well, the first calculation is in 2-712. It is the cost of cover. If the buyer goes out and gets alternative goods, widgets, a toaster, then it would be the cost of the replacement goods less the contract price. That differential plus incidentals and plus consequentials. The buyer can get consequentials under the UCC where the seller cannot. So plus consequentials, less expenses saved. What if the buyer does not cover and simply says, I'm breached, but I'm not going to buy an alternative good? It is the non-cover market price. What is the market price when the buyer learns of the breach? At the moment, the buyer could cover but doesn't. What is the market price at that point minus the contract price? You take that differential, you add incidentals and you add consequentials, okay? Less expenses saved. There is one trick. If the buyer, or one special rule you need to keep in mind, it's the most testable. If the buyer fails to cover, but could have, and uses this non-cover aspect, then if the buyer did cover and he or she could have avoided consequential losses, he or she does not get them. So if you could cover and you don't, you may lose your chance at consequential damages. If you don't cover but you couldn't cover, you might still get your consequential damages. And the idea is, if you could cover and you decide not to, then you shouldn't get the consequentials that you could have saved had you done cover. Okay? With regard to specific performance, the buyer can also get it under 2-716. One last thing, it's the idea. This shows up kind of a lot. If the buyer breaches, should the seller resell? And what if the seller does resell, even at a higher price? Does the seller get stuck with 2706 resale price damages? Or can the seller resell, but still opt for the 27808 lost profit type damages? And the majority basically, and the current trend is to give the seller the choice. Under 1-305, liberally construe these damages. And so I'll talk about that a little bit more in class. Happy Thanksgiving.